Good morning. Good morning, everybody. We're so happy to have you all on the phone with us today. Welcome to our deep dive into the long-range plan. I've got just an all-star cast of friends of the university here with me today, and I'm so excited to have you on the phone with us. One note before we get going is that the lines are muted, so if you have questions, we invite them through the Zoom chat module, and we will be monitoring. We are recording the call so we can send it out to the rest of the members of the committees that were unable to join us today. And at this time, I'm going to, and I'm so pleased to introduce my friend Donna Garton, who is going to moderate our call. Donna graduated in 1979 with an undergraduate degree in international relations, started working in development and as the director of the Cardinal Club, fundraising for women's athletic scholarships. Donna took a short break from Stanford to work in the state legislature and returned in 2009, where she held various roles in engagement outreach for the Office of Development and the Alumni Association. And she's been a very active reunion volunteer alongside you all at Stanford for many years, and this year included. So thank you so much. Also a parent of two Stanford graduates, and I realized I didn't introduce myself. I'm Erin Holderson, Director of Class Giving here at Stanford, so thank you all for your time. And I'll turn it over to Donna.
Thank you, Erin. Thanks for all your work in putting this all together. So welcome to all of our reunion volunteers on this call. I understand we have 125 of us, so an incredible turnout. We're incredibly appreciative of your time, talent, and treasure to celebrate our collective reunions. I'm honored to be a member of the mighty fine class of 1979 reunion committee, and I also have the great privilege of working here at Stanford as part of my role. I staff volunteer committees in the Office of Development, and from that perspective, I have an even deeper appreciation for the difference that every one of you make, both through philanthropy and through the incredible work that you do to inspire all of our classmates to engage with the university. So for that, we thank you very deeply. Before I introduce our panelists, I wanted to provide a brief background on the long-range planning process. As some of you know, this is a process that was launched by the President and Provost 2 years ago, beginning with a call for ideas, producing a lot of ideas, 2,808 to be exact, including 500 from alumni. So thank you to those of you who did those. These ideas were synthesized into 37 white papers, each one exploring a specific initiative. And from that, 23 design teams were formed, each comprised of faculty and staff, to take a deeper dive into the initiatives that were being studied. The roles of these design teams was to make recommendations to senior leaders, and by that, the senior leaders was the University Executive Cabinet. And if you're super interested in learning more about their work, you can on their website, which is ourvision.stanford.edu. I encourage you to go there. It's really, really well done and super informative. From there, all of these proposals were grouped into 3 thematic themes. And today, the next stage of the process, we are moving into the piloting and preparing for implementation. This morning, we have the great opportunity to hear from 3 extraordinary leaders from different design teams. And I'll start out with introducing, we'll get to the fun part of this call now. It's my pleasure to introduce Harry Elam, Senior Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, Vice President for the Arts, the Freeman Thornton Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education, the Palmer Professor in the Humanities, and Bass University Fellow in Undergraduate Education. In addition to his work at Stanford, he's an accomplished director and author and has received 5 teaching awards here at Stanford. Quite extraordinary. He was also most recently elected into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He's a true university treasure, and we thank you, Harry, for being here today.
Thank you.
In his role and all the roles that he plays, he's actually today going to speak to us about the leader of the ResX initiative, a comprehensive proposal to study the future of undergraduate residential experience. I'd also like to welcome and thank Jeremy Weinstein for joining us. Jeremy, Professor of Political Science, the Fisher Family Director of Global Studies, as well as Senior Fellow at FSI and CEPR. He is also Faculty Co-Director of the Immigration Policy Lab and the Data for Development Initiative. In addition, he's a non-resident fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington, D.C. Jeremy won the Carl Deutsch Award for the Best Scholar Under 40, who's made the most significant contributions to the study of international relations. He's also served at the highest levels of government, including most recently as Deputy to the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations from 2013 to 2015. And in his spare time, Jeremy is the design team co-director for Social Problem Solving Team, which aims to push the frontiers of social science and craft solutions and policies for changing societal issues, such as economic opportunity, polarization, and ineffective institutions. Also joining us here today is Lisa Blaydes, co-chair of the Changing Human Experience team. We are looking forward to hearing a lot about what you're studying. She is professor of political science and senior fellow at FSI. She is also the director of the Abbasi program in Islamic studies and co-director of the program on Arab reform and democracy. She is the author of Elections and Distributive Politics in Mubarak's Egypt and State of Repression, Iraq under Saddam Hussein. And in her spare time, she leads the design team as co-chair of the Changing Human Experience, which I already mentioned, and it's focused on deepening our understanding of humanity, past, present, and future, through thought, culture, arts, institutions, and behaviors. So thank you all for joining us here today. Very, very much appreciate it. So I will start out with this conversation and ask each of you to take a few minutes to give us a snapshot of what your design team was focused on and specifically what problem or issues you were seeking to address with your work. Harry, I think I'll start with you.
Okay.
In mid-April, the ResX task force released final recommendations which have been accepted by the president and provost. There was a ton in this report, so if you were to call out the 2 or 3 biggest changes that were recommended, what would they be?
Sure. So the biggest change was in developing an overall and comprehensive vision for residential life at Stanford. Now, having a vision for particular residences is something we had. And as you probably know, we have some 80 different types of residents at Stanford, and some of them really are effective in terms of what they do and what they plan for within that particular house. However, the sense of an overall comprehensive vision is something we lacked. And so that's something that we worked on and revolves around the idea of neighborhoods. Neighborhoods being a cluster of housing that provides for continuity over time for students who live in that neighborhood and for the residential experience as a whole. Another important change was around the housing of first-year students. Now, we traditionally have housed about 65% of first-year students, but 80% want to live in first-year housing. So what we've done with ResEd is determined that anyone who wants to live in first-year housing can. Exclusively all first-year housing rather than dorms that have 4 years of students within them. So that was number 2. Number 3 important change was around the draw. And the draw has been something that has been originally set up to help and bring community and help make it easier in terms of the housing process, but the exact opposite has happened. Students have been subject to chance in terms of the draw, and 46% of the students try to avoid the draw totally. So instead of having that system of the draw presently in place, we are going to have a system that allows students to draw by neighborhood. And so that's going to make it so that you have incentive to stay in the neighborhood. And also within that neighborhood, as you go up in years, you get better housing. So that too will be incentive, and that we hope will eliminate some of the stress around living in or drawing the draw system. So those are the 3 major things that I would say.
Terrific, thank you so much. Jeremy, please give us a little overview of what it is that you're working on.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for being on the call. I had the privilege and pleasure of co-chairing the Social Problem Solving Design Team, and we really began our work by taking a look at many of these proposals that came in. And one of the things that was striking in looking at these proposals was that there was a shared ambition across the university, regardless of discipline, regardless of people's particular thematic focus, a desire to really accelerate Stanford's impact on social problems, not only in our surrounding communities, but more broadly. And the big idea that we arrived at over the course of a year of work, a team of 10 faculty members and 10 senior staff from across the university, but consulting with faculty, alumni, staff, community members, is that the R&D infrastructure in our society for solving social problems is broken. And something that Stanford uniquely gets is how to build an R&D infrastructure. We've built an R&D infrastructure for medicine and the life sciences that takes advances in the natural sciences and turns them in a pipeline to generate advances in treatments and technologies that can help address human health. We've also built an R&D infrastructure in technology. We've fueled the growth of Silicon Valley, thinking about how advances in our disciplines, including in engineering, can turn into technology products that will change human life. But our R&D infrastructure in society for social problems is broken. There's neither the investment that's required, universities are not organized in a way to facilitate the kind of testing and iteration around insights about how to address social problems, and the uptake mechanisms for these kinds of science-based insights are really not in place. And so at the center of the proposal to the trustees and the university leadership from the social problem design team is a commitment to resourcing, launching, and supporting what we call impact labs. Impact labs are formal partnerships between teams of Stanford faculty and external collaborators in the public, social, and private sectors, who together make a multi-year commitment to tackle a tractable social problem jointly, marrying the scientific advances that Stanford can bring to the table with leadership from practitioners in these different sectors. And our ambition over time is to be in a position to support up to 20 impact labs on 5 to 8 year cycles, working on a variety of different problems that reflect the interests of faculty members and the openness that they have from collaborators, whether in government, in nonprofits, in philanthropy, or the private sector. And importantly, while research is at the core of this R&D infrastructure, these impact labs will also provide a platform that we can use to re-envision how we teach and train Stanford students to think about how they impact social problems. As just one example of that, we've experienced a real shift in undergraduate majors, with many students leaving some of our core social science departments to major in computer science and in engineering. But many of those students actually share a passion that many of us in the social sciences have for applying their skills to work on social problems. And so one of the key educational initiatives that will come out of the social problem design team is a set of new educational pathways that enable people to pair the technical competencies that they're gaining in computation and data science with the application, both the domain knowledge that they need, but also experience in applying their technical competencies on real-world social problems through these impact labs. So we're excited about this. This is a big idea. None of our peer institutions are doing anything like this. And it really represents what we think is one of the critical frontiers in the social sciences, not just for H&S, but for social scientists sitting in the School of Education, Business, the medical school, engineering, and Stanford Earth across the university.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm sure we're going to have a lot more interesting follow-up questions to that overview. I appreciate that. Lisa, please.
Hi, so I had the opportunity to serve as the co-chair with Ian Morris of the design team focused on the changing human experience. Now, this is a little different than some of the other initiatives in that we are a research initiative. So this initiative is focused on trying to create knowledge in basic research rather than applied research. So why think about the changing human experience? Well, we know the human experience has arguably changed more in the past 100 years than it did in the previous 100,000. Globally, life expectancy at birth averages 30 years longer than it did even a century ago, and better nutrition has increased average heights by multiple centimeters, and real income has increased around the world. Before the First World War, only a small number of men and virtually no women had the opportunity to even choose their own leaders. So there have been huge changes in the last 100 years in the nature of the human experience. But alongside these advances, we've also invented weapons of mass destruction, enough to end all life on Earth. We've started to poison our planet and oceans. New communicable diseases strain humanity's defenses against fast-spreading biological dangers. And enduring inequalities within and between societies threaten to undo advances in racial, gender, and social equality. So all over the world, the last 100 years have seen bewildering rapid change. Now, the knowledge that we need to tackle some of these pressing problems are rooted in our understanding of changing human attitudes, values, behaviors, cultures, and our ability to cooperate with one another. So our goal with this research initiative is to make sure that Stanford really spearheads the interpretation as well as the transformation of the human experience in the 21st century. So we see a lot of intellectual energy around these issues in different disciplines in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And we anticipate that with the proper resources, Stanford can really have a transformative effect on understanding these dimensions of the changing human experience.
Thank you, Lisa. Super interesting. So Harry, let's go back to you. You highlighted a few really important initiatives that are coming out of the ResX study. And when I think about when I was in Wilbur my freshman year, that is a huge part of how I think about Stanford. So as we think about the changes, including all-fresh housing for first-year students and this idea of the neighborhood, and then, of course, eliminating the draw.
Changing the draw.
Changing the draw. Thank you. Changing the draw. How is this so important now? I mean, why has it become so important? And can you tell us also, share a little bit about how this can become and is truly uniquely at Stanford?
Sure. So I think the why now is a couple of reasons. One is that we are faced with situations in terms of housing or in terms of undergraduate education that just weren't around previously. We have concerns around health and mental health and well-being, more profound than we've ever seen and critical to every aspect of the university and of our society today as it faces students 18 to 24-year-olds or people in that same age group. So health and well-being became one of our primary concerns. Another is related to that, and that's the idea of how do we build community and belonging. Belonging is a key for students to feel and that they are a part of the experience at Stanford and that they can do their best and thrive within that experience. And the third, one of these principles that we were looking at was that we wanted to be a place that allows for intellectual and personal growth. So those things, health and well-being, belonging and community and personal and intellectual growth were all key factors in us determining what sort of system we wanted to set up. Let me return to the idea of the neighborhoods and what they will do. So imagine the neighborhood is about 700 people. And if you think around the campus and the fact that we have some 7,000 students now, that's 10 neighborhoods, potentially 11 neighborhoods as we grow over time, as the president and the trustees have said we plan to over the next few years. So the neighborhoods then become a place that you live and provide continuity through time. There'll be a place where you can have relationships over time. There'll be a place where you can have services. So mental health, social working services can be there. Advising can be in the neighborhood. Tutoring can be in the neighborhood. Also places to rehearse, to perform, to make things, all of that can be in the neighborhood. A central thing that we saw as we went around and looked at our peers in terms of their spaces, that dining was key. So in each of the neighborhoods, they will be a space for dining and community to gather there as well. We see the neighborhoods as a place that will also have a different sort of government, the meaning that they will have students who work together on ideas within the neighborhood, and also faculty and resident faculty who do the same. So that will be another space that will help in terms of developing leadership, but also in developing community and speaking to the community needs within the neighborhood. I mentioned and talked a little bit about the draw, and I want to return to that idea that you'll draw in the neighborhood. So meaning that what will happen is that the students in the first year, as they become rising sophomores, will choose last, but choosing first or seniors, and they will get the best housing. And what we've seen in that housing is that we want some of that housing to look like the kind of idiosyncratic spaces that we have elsewhere on the campus, that will have spaces particularly that argue for independent living for seniors. And then juniors will draw on more housing that speaks to juniors and sophomores will draw after that. Now, being Stanford, we still will allow choice, meaning that if you don't want to live in your neighborhood, you can live in another neighborhood, and you can live in that neighborhood with a group of folks, but you will go to the bottom of the draw in that neighborhood the first year to de-incentivize change. But nonetheless, after that, you'll go into your regular group. So the draw will change. The draw will be simply by neighborhood. The neighborhood will be a structure that is one that we hope students will feel at home within and feel that they can find community and belonging. But those are the things that compelled us in this direction.
Sounds absolutely on target, and certainly addresses many of the needs that we consider and think about in terms of challenges.
Yeah, and let me just to cover one more quickly that I've left out, and that is just the housing stock. When we went around and looked at our peers, Harvard was doing $2.4 billion of work on their residences. Yale just added 2 new colleges to the tune of $500,000. Needless to say, we don't want to get into the growth campaign with them, but nonetheless, we know that our housing staff needs work. So what we'll try to do is bring up the quality of that housing stock as we build new as well. One other thing that all the changes speak to is that, as particularly under health and well-being, I mentioned, is that the student body is changing today. Stanford is getting a student body that's diverse in more than any other way, is diverse in terms of its class demographics. 18% of the incoming students in this next class are first-gen low income students, and how we make a space that appeals to or is right for all our students and their needs as part of the process that we hope will be accomplished in the new neighborhood plan.
Very exciting. Thank you so much for sharing that. Now I'm going to turn to Jeremy. And a couple of things. I heard some really, really interesting things that you were talking about, and I'm wondering if when you think about Stanford and how we have worked so collaboratively and interdisciplinary, that's been sort of a hallmark of our institution. Can you sort of tell us a little bit how that might be taken to the next level and under social exchange, and how potentially you could give us some examples of some of those partnerships that are starting to form?
Yeah, great. So I really think so what's come out of the social problem design team is something that we're currently calling the social exchange. And the social exchange is really the natural next step in Stanford's evolution. At the core of the university is excellence in our departments and schools. And we have to maintain that as our foundation. Just superlative faculty, PhD students, undergraduates across all of our departments. Under the leadership of Hennessy and Etch, we really pushed the envelope in terms of breaking down barriers that exist across disciplines and schools. And the interdisciplinary institutes were really at the core of those kinds of conversations. We really see the social exchange as the natural next step in this evolution, moving from strengthened departments and breaking down barriers across departments to pushing out beyond the university. And we put at the center of pushing out beyond the university what we call problem-focused partnerships. So impact labs are built around these problem-focused partnerships that connect Stanford faculty and students to those who actually have the authority and the resources to make actual progress on social problems in the world. So let me be concrete about what an impact lab could look like and use a couple examples of our own faculty who've really pioneered this kind of work. Let me start with Jennifer Eberhardt, who's a social psychologist who's been at Stanford for a long time. And she's really an expert on issues of implicit bias. Now, the traditional way that people have studied issues like implicit bias is in a lab where a bunch of undergraduates are recruited to look at video images and you sort of measure their behavior. That's been the bread and butter of psychological research for a long time. But about 7 years ago, the Oakland Police Department was mandated by its sort of a federal judge to go through a process of really interrogating and looking seriously at the relationships between the Oakland PD and surrounding community members. And issues of bias and mistreatment on the basis of protected characteristics like race were at the core of that mandate from the judge. And so Jennifer got involved in a deep partnership with the Oakland Police Department that involved taking all of this data that the Oakland PD collects on traffic stops, on the video footage from body-worn cameras, and really working with the Oakland Police Department to understand patterns of bias and mistreatment in a very systematic way. And that data exercise that she was involved in engaged faculty from across the university, not just Jennifer leading this effort from psychology, but folks in linguistics and folks in computer science, so that she could generate a set of science-based recommendations that would help the Oakland Police Department think about who they recruit, how they monitor, how they train, how they hold people accountable when mistreatment is observed. So over 50 recommendations came out of that, and Oakland PD is now in a process of implementing those recommendations. That's a problem-focused partnership. It's something that takes 5 to 7 years to see from the beginning to the end. It puts science at the core, something that Stanford can uniquely bring, but it roots the research in the world. It roots the research in a partnership. And so that's at the center of the kind of work that we're envisioning. We have faculty members in various parts of the university that are already leaning in on these kinds of issues, working on inequality and reskilling, working on political polarization, working on the administrative state and the way in which our government is broken and isn't responsive to the needs of citizens. So we have a set of examples of this work, but the whole vision to build an R&D infrastructure is that we should have 10x the number of examples that we have, that doing this kind of work, this extended multi-year partnership-focused work, requires a different level of resources and kind of infrastructure and kind of professional support than Stanford has ever had for the social sciences, and then for any of our peer institutions have. And in essence, we think this is a way of really re-envisioning the research university for the 21st century, making the research university not just something that operates in the ivory tower, something that's seen as elite and separate, but something that's actually seen as an engine for making progress on these issues, something that really is desperately needed by society, not just in the United States, but around the world.
Well, and Stanford's mission of teaching, research, and service seems to be bundled into so much of what you are addressing and speaking to. So thank you so very much. Lisa, just to hear a little bit more, I understand that you presented to the Board of Trustees in mid-April, and that you organized your initiative into sort of 4 broad categories and themes. Could you share a little bit about how that rubric kind of helped you think through the next stage, and how did these areas emerge?
Yes, absolutely. As Donna mentioned before, we received literally hundreds of proposals from faculty across campus related to their interest in new research areas. And we tried to really organize these into a meaningful way to reflect the diverse interests of our arts, humanities, and social science faculty. And as we began to undertake this work, we came to realize that these fundamental changes in the human experience really constituted a core theme in what people were interested in studying. And we found that if we could kind of cluster these into 4 main areas related to the changing body, the changing mind, the changing globe, and changing political communities, we could encapsulate a lot of the most vibrant energy in terms of faculty research across campus. So these are really abstract categories. You're probably wondering, what do these categories mean? I'm going to start with one example just to give you a sense of what does it mean to study the changing human body as an object of understanding in the humanities, arts, and social sciences. So we know that human bodies are really different things today than they were even 100 years ago, thanks to improved nutrition, things like stunting and wasting that were nearly universal aspects of the 19th century experience are now rare outside the world's poorest countries. And we know in rich countries, food shortages are so rare that obesity has actually replaced malnutrition as a major public health concern. We also know humans are living longer lives, that globally life expectancy is nearly double what it was before, and these longer lives offer opportunities in the 21st century. At the same time, they pose extraordinary challenges because the social, economic institutions that we have surrounding our lives are actually built from previous models, 19th century models. The cultural norms around things like childhood, motherhood, or retirement are actually built on historical understandings of much shorter life expectancy. So the timing of life stages has remained relatively static in the face of all of these changes and what it means to be a human with a longer life. So we want to try to understand with this part of the research initiative, things like the implications of longer lives for our understanding of education, work, artistic expression, and the search for meaning in life. We also know that people have managed to engineer their bodies in ways that were unthinkable even a generation ago. And this really blurs the boundaries between humans and our technological innovations. So our growing ability to intervene in human bodies actually raises a lot of profound ethical questions, questions about rights, responsibilities, and inequalities. Who gets the opportunity to enjoy these new bioengineering changes? And who's left out of the opportunity to engage in the elongation of human life? So we want to try to also, with this initiative, understand how new developments in bioengineering challenge entrenched ideas about what our bodies mean. Finally, if we see the human body as more fluid and revisable than we ever did in the past, not just as a product of biology and culture, but also we want to try to raise questions about what it means, categories like race and gender, what they mean. Now, we know that historically race and gender were some of the most common bodily bases for discrimination in human history. But how do changing conceptions about the body influence our ideas of race, gender, and sexual orientation? So our goal with this part of the initiative is try to tackle big questions like this related to the human experience, and to do this not just in the domain of the changing body, but also related to the changing mind, the changing globe, and changing political communities.
Thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate that. We're going to go back one more time. And so as we go through our panelists another time, anyone who wants to submit questions, please feel free to do so on the Zoom platform chat, or email them to Aaron. So we will circle back again. And Jeremy, I'm going to ask you another question. And that is, we've heard a lot about this sort of co-creation sort of idea. Could you sort of expand a little bit more on what that means and how that would be thought through in your initiative?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So, when I came of age as a social scientist trained in a traditional graduate program and began as an assistant professor, people would often think about the role of social science in informing what happens in the world through the lens of translation. The idea is that the sort of people exist in a university, they're looking at problems, they're trying to understand them, they're pushing the frontiers of disciplinary knowledge, and that part of our challenge is to then translate the findings of this academic progress to broader audiences through public communication, through participating in public deliberation in various ways. And I think translation is a really important way in which academics, university professors, PhD students engage in the world. But I think we're also at a moment where we need to complement these approaches that are focused on translation with what we call co-creation. Co-creation is the idea that we are working in deep partnership to co-design, in some sense, what are the scientific questions that we need to tackle? What are the contributions that different stakeholders can bring to the table? So university faculty and the university brings to the table disciplinary knowledge and data analytic techniques and research design and methodologies. But practitioners, whether they're in government or the social sector, nonprofits, philanthropies, they bring living laboratories to the table. That is, everything that they do on a daily basis is an effort to try and understand social problems, to intervene in the world, to shape social problems. And so we need to recognize the importance of both of those contributions to making progress on science, but also to making progress on application. And so that makes us think about what is really needed in this co-creation architecture is not just a shared agenda, but also a cycle of iteration where questions are asked, hypotheses are framed, data is collected, interventions are tested, we learn from those interventions. And by building that into the process from the outset, in contrast to the model that focuses on translation, we put ourselves in a position where the uptake of insights, the way in which science can then be translated into behavioral change, new policies, new programs, new interventions, these are things that are baked in from the outset. That is, you have a set of, if you'll forgive the parallel, customers for the insights that come from science who are waiting and understand and engaged in the process of generating these insights. And I think that is a different and new model for social science. It is not the only model for social science, but we think it's a really important frontier model for social science and one that we're excited about supporting.
Thank you. I think that's actually a really good segue into the next question for Lisa. You talked about the changing body, but you also referred to the changing mind. You know that Stanford launched an Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence earlier this spring. Can you sort of potentially touch upon how that theme might intersect with that new institute?
Yeah, absolutely. The human-centered AI is focused on how to make artificial intelligence work to serve the collective needs of humanity. Our interest in understanding the changing human mind is focused on how new inputs are changing how humans think, make decisions, and process experiences. So we know that media and technology are some of the most ubiquitous elements of modern cultural life. Yet some neuroscientists actually think that the cultures our powerful brains have allowed us to create are now feeding back into the ways that our brains work. Cognitive psychologists have also shown us that we scarcely understand our own feelings, motives, and reasons for action. Indeed, many of the new discoveries about the human mind are at odds with our own conceptions of self. So as the pace of these new discoveries really begins to increase with our developments in the biosciences, we need to try to make sense of the human mind in light of these facts. How are we able to rationalize ourselves as social, neurological, biological beings with our picture of ourselves as responsible, rational, and moral beings?
Thank you, Lisa. And as I hear all of this incredible content, Harry, I ask you, as part of the design team work that you led, there was a lot of thinking and focus on how majors will be developed and how the first year curriculum will be thought through. Listening to some of these things, how are you thinking about those changes and how they might be implemented?
So I think one of the great things about Stanford is the connection of research to teaching. And as Jeremy and Lisa both laid out plans for their the different design teams and what they're going to do, the pedagogical is a part of that. So there's going to be a space for undergraduates potentially to be involved as research, in terms of research assistants in some way. But also courses will come out. Like one of the most exciting courses, since he's here with us, I have to trumpet it, is a course that Jeremy is teaching along with Mehran Sahami and Rob Reish on technology and ethics and policy. And it's a course they capped at 300 people and could have done much more than that. But it's the kind of course that brings in research and teaching, but also looks at big problems. And as Lisa and Jeremy laid out, there are problems that need complex and integrative solutions, and that's going to allow for us to make, or allow for us to help undergraduates think about those problems differently and think about how they can engage in them and think about their approach to problem solving and having an impact in our world. One of the important things about the residence in this is the residence is a space where these conversations can take place. One of the things the president wanted to look at is the first year in particular in terms of teaching. And in that first year, the thing that we have that's closest to a shared intellectual experience is CS 106A, Introduction to Programming, which is a great course, and it's great that students will work on it together. But we want something else for that first year in terms of that experience. We want a space where students can really think together about things like liberal education and why they're there, things like what makes them a citizen. And I'm mentioning this first year's working on this. This hasn't been decided, and it's something that has to go through the faculty senate for it to actually be put in place. And that is a new plan for the first year that would be about a shared intellectual experience, that all students in the first year would study and look at questions of liberal education and their purpose. Why are they at Stanford, or what does it mean to be at Stanford? So we can get students to stop, potentially stop thinking of school just as a means to an end of employment, but something more within that is happening, and what is happening in terms of, and why is a liberal education at this time and the date so important? So that's the first quarter that would look at self in that way. The second quarter would look at citizenship, and it would start with Stanford citizenship and the idea of the fundamental standard as well as the honor code, and look at those questions of citizenship on through time, or I mean, wider than that. So the first quarter is on self, the second would be on society. The third quarter would be on global issues, and looking at global issues and from a variety of perspectives, and also disciplines in the sciences as well as potentially in the humanities and arts. So that's a plan what the first year committee is looking at right now. We'll see how that evolves through the faculty senate. One thing that's happening in par with that, in pace with that, is a look at majors. And there's a design team looking at the 21st century major. And one of the things it's trying to do is ask the question, what do we need in a major? What sort of things should all majors have? And what can we see as generalizable across majors? The second thing it's looking at is a particularly Stanford problem, because we are the wild, wild west and someplace that believes in independence. We have majors that have 55 units all the way up to majors that have 135 units. And none of our peers have that type of range. And what we'd like to see is potentially what the president called a decompression of the major, to move it down between 60 and 100 units. And hopefully that would be something that would open up the first year to the way that I just explained it, but it would also open it up to students being able to take intellectual risks. Right now, they feel like they've got to fill up the first year with things that will help them in terms of STEM degrees. And this is something we want to impact as well. But what we see is that happening in the residence, that it's a place for development of intellectual and personal growth that I mentioned. And that's going to tie to this idea of really integrating with what's outside of that in terms of the design teams and what's been proposed as well.
Sounds like an exciting time to want to be applying to Stanford in the next decade. For
Oh,
sure,
yes.
for sure. We all need to come back to school. Are there any questions from, there are some questions coming in, but in the meantime, and you've sort of touched on this, but one came in earlier, submitted ahead of time, and it's actually a two-part question. I'm going to probably ask Lisa and Harry to respond to this. How is Stanford responding to the college admission scandal? And then the follow-up question was, how do I respond to the classmate who no longer wants to contribute because he thinks people only want to come to Stanford to study computer science, to do a startup, get filthy rich, and have 2 Ferraris in the driveway? Nobody wants a liberal arts education anymore. So potentially, I'll ask the two of you to take that one on. And Harry, you did a good job of teeing that up already. But.
Sure, and just in terms of the admission scandal, know that the university takes this very, very seriously, and know that the president has made it a priority. And you may have read his statements on the particular case and the involvement of Stanford within the scandal in and around admissions. So one of the things that we've taken up is that we look at the admission of athletes somewhat differently, in the sense that each individual athlete will be examined to make sure they are doing what they claim to be doing in that particular sport. In some sports it's easy, in some sports it will take a little bit more due diligence, but that's going to be necessary as part of the process now. The second thing is more global in terms of the admissions, and that is thinking about how we do admissions and revisiting that in ways that may eventually change or just be reaffirmed in the process. I think that our admissions team and Dean Rickshaw do an amazing job at looking at as many applications and determining that every application is read twice by someone. But one of the things we believed in over time is intergenerational loyalty. That's an important part of Stanford over time. We've also believed in creating a class and having that class be diverse as possible, so that we haven't had a white majority at Stanford in the past 15 years. And that makeup speaks to the makeup of California, speaks to the makeup of our country as a whole, and that's been a factor in terms of the admissions process. Another factor is that we want the best and the brightest from wherever background that they can, and that has been something we've reinforced over time. So a committee this year, let me take one more step back. There is a committee called QAFA in the Stanford acronym, which stands for the Committee on Undergraduate Admission and Financial Aid. It's a faculty committee that looks over and works with the admissions office, because the faculty ultimately determine the philosophy of how students are admitted to Stanford. And this year, what's going to happen is the Faculty Senate has decided that this special committee that they choose and comes up around special issues like this one, admissions, Policy and Planning Board will look into admissions over the course of next year and make recommendations on it. If they think about that there's things they want to change, or as I said, reaffirm, they'll make those recommendations to the Faculty Senate this year.
Thank you. Well, you're certainly taking this issue seriously and doing a lot to combat and solve for it. So Lisa, can you comment a little bit about the other Ferrari issue?
Yeah, so I think that it's actually much more complicated than that. We know that Stanford is now admitting a lot more first-gen students.
Yes.
I find a lot of these students are under pressure from their families to choose majors where they think they're going to have an opportunity to really boost themselves into the middle or upper middle class after they graduate. And so I don't know that it's really a question about everyone just coming in and wanting a Ferrari. You know, a lot of students look for jobs in what was a pretty tough economy for some of the past years. And so I think people are making choices based on those opportunities and incentives. But I think what we need to do is really try to just get the students into the classroom with some of these humanities, arts, and social science faculty, because I think that they'll really see that these are absolutely vital issues, not only for their learning, but also for their lives. And so we got rid of something called the Introduction to the Humanities, which many of you guys probably remember from some point in the past, the IHUM. And we didn't really replace it with what I consider to be a meaningful substitute for that Introduction to the Humanities. But with this program that Harry's talking about, with the new shared first year experience, if we can really do a first quarter on the liberal arts and why a liberal education, a quarter on democratic citizenship and social citizenship, and a quarter on global citizenship, these are really vital issues that I think will get our students back into the classroom on the humanities, social science, and arts side of campus, and really help to kind of make an adjustment in what I see as a little bit of an imbalance right now in the way our students are oriented.
Thank you, Lisa. Jerry, did you
I
want
just want to add one thing, because Harry mentioned this course that we taught, a political scientist, a philosopher, and a CS professor called Computers, Ethics, and Public Policy. And it's just, and this was over-enrolled. I mean, seniors, juniors, sophomores, freshmen. The appetite for thinking about not just technology to make money, but technology's impact on society and how we amplify benefits and mitigate harms is really there in our students. And the challenge is to position ourselves as a university to meet that demand. It had been the case in the past that the ethics course in computer science was taught by a computer science professor. And we decided that what we really needed to do was meet students where they were. If they're not going to show up in my classroom where I'm teaching political science, I'm going to go teach them how to think like a social scientist in the CS department, and force them to answer questions about how we decide under what conditions we use algorithmic decision-making in the public sector, or when is too much power in the hands of an internet platform something that needs to be challenged with regulation, or how much data should be made available to companies and to government to use notionally for your benefit, but also for their benefit as well. These are questions that when you're going through programming and machine learning and advanced probability and statistics, you don't grapple with. But when you exist in the world, you have to grapple with them. And so I think there's a way in which seeing these as distinct parts of the university, that you get your dose of humanities and your dose of social sciences and arts, et cetera, the way we've traditionally thought about breadth requirements, is not producing the outcomes that we want. And what we really need, in addition to this integrative first year experience that Harry described, is a set of faculty to begin to do the hard work of teaching at these intersections, because that's where our students exist, and they really need to grapple with these questions in a more integrated framework.
Yes.
That's a very powerful wrap-up statement about how Stanford, I think, is really so focused, and appropriately so, on the whole student, and what we try to do in terms of an institution to promote and educate leaders for the future. And I think it's not only about the in-classroom study, but it's also the outside of the classroom study and the support services that we provide here and that we find so profoundly important. And to that, Harry, I wonder if there's anything else you touched on. Sort of the students are a little bit of today are different from the students in the past, and the kinds of things that you think about what we're trying to do currently and what we might want to think about doing in the future.
Sure. I mentioned that mental health is a real concern with our incoming students. I'll give you a situation, or data rather, that helps think about that, and that is when we do a pre-FOSH survey. And in that pre-FOSH survey, some 71% of our students were saying that they felt overwhelmed in high school. And so the pressure of high school is great nowadays, and the pressure from that of getting into school. And we add to that pressure. And some, of course, is expected. College is rigorous, and Stanford is rigorous, and that's to be expected. But there are other stressors that aren't as clearly part of the experience, or shouldn't be part of the experience. For first-gen low-income students, we find that that stress is even greater, that sense of trying to fit in and trying to really belong here is exacerbated, and so we see stress at a higher level. But that stress is something that we're seeing across the board. I had a couple of years ago, a faculty member come to talk with me because this is Carol Dweck, she's been teaching a course, introductory seminar for some 12, 13 years in the first quarter. It's a great course, got written up in the New York Times as was 10 of the cool courses to take in college. And so she got lots of applications, but she was finding those first quarter students that they were feeling incredibly anxious on the first day of school. And that's the kind of a situation we want to impact. So one of the places that I mentioned where we hope to have an impact is in the residence. And so that means what happens through the RA in the dorm, resident assistants in the dorm, the RFs in the all-frosh dorm, but also in the services that are available in the neighborhood. We talked about having social services embedded in the neighborhood. And in fact, this is something that the Vice Provost for Student Affairs, Susie Brubaker-Cole, was going to try out on an experimental basis with 3, and you could call them social workers. They're going to be embedded in communities and be able to potentially work with teams of students within that, but also individual students to head off potential problems that might come up, or also to speak with them when necessary, and also to make the stigma about seeking help, mental help, potentially dissipate. So that's something that we're going to try out this year, and that program is thanks to a donor who foresaw the need to help in terms of mental health and to support this. So, but the dorms are in place, I think, because it's where students live, because it's where they interact with other students, that we really have to think acutely about questions of mental health.
Thank you. That's truly important. I'm wondering if there are any other things that Lisa, Jeremy, Harry, you'd like to add before we have one final question for wrapping up. Any additional comments or?
Maybe one thing I'd say is that the process that the president and the provost have led has really engaged large swaths of campus, faculty, staff, students, alumni, community members, and that's been challenging and time-consuming, but also energizing, in the sense that I hope what you hear from the contributions that each of us have made to the discussion today is an effort to recognize Stanford's profound strengths and position as really one of the elite universities in the world, but also our willingness to ask ourselves hard questions about the research that we're doing, the way in which we teach, the way we support students, the way we organize residential life, because we want to be in a position where we're constantly reinventing ourselves. Just because we're good, just because we attract a lot of students, have great faculty, doesn't mean that we should be an unchanging institution. And so this has really been an exercise, I think, for the campus as a whole in asking ourselves hard questions, and there really being no sacred cows beyond the fact that we are located in California and we aspire to excellence. But really asking ourselves hard questions and putting ourselves in a position to think about what the university ought to be doing decades into the future, not just tomorrow. And I think that's an exciting and important enterprise. It's hard, but it means that the kinds of things that we are talking about are things that put us in a position to thrive for a long period in the future.
The only thing I'll add is that, you should keep in mind that I think that Stanford's ambitions are just staggering. If you think about a university that strives to not only be the best on the engineering and science side, but also has some of the best arts, humanities, and social science faculty in the world, on top of having the amazing professional schools we have and Division I sports, right? So there's no other university in the world who really does everything that Stanford does. And I think that really means that we're in a unique position to try to think about integrating these different aspects of community life, university life, research in a way that I think is not really possible anywhere else. And so, the complexity of what happens here is really, for me, very profound. And so I think it's really a very special place to try to engage with students and make these types of changes and work with the president to try to just create a better opportunity in university for the future.
So just picking up on both those points, you hear behind it the sense that what we're trying to do is potentially expand the impact of Stanford. And to that end, what Lisa said in terms of Stanford's excellence the president has said that because we're excellent across the board, we should do more, and we can do more. And picking up on Jeremy's point, what makes it somewhat different now in terms of this plan, with a long-range plan going forward, is the idea of impact and what the president calls purposefulness, that we can be a purposeful university, and that all that we're doing is to make change and to make the world better. So it's a pretty exciting time, as Donna said, to be at Stanford University.
So powerful. All these statements are so powerful. And as we think about ourselves as fundraising volunteers and what we're trying to do in terms of support the university and provide philanthropy and inspiration, I think you've given us an incredible platform upon which for us to do our work. I also want to acknowledge that we oftentimes come across the question of Stanford seems so rich, why do you need my support? And I wonder, as a tactical sort of question that we could ask you in terms of how we do our work better, what your perspective is on that. And Harry, I think I'll start with you.
So even with Stanford's impressive endowment, approximately 20% of Stanford's operating expenses are funded by endowment income, making us under-endowed relative to our peers. So the simple fact is Stanford's endowment is not sufficient to meet the current demands for the tremendous work that is done on campus and the things that are so important to Stanford, such as need-blind admissions and supporting our enhanced financial aid policy. A case in point, a couple of years ago, I was at our campus in Berlin, sitting across from a first-gen kid from outside of Plano, Texas. And as I talked to him, I found out not only was he the only student in his graduating class to come to Stanford, he was the only kid in his class to go to college. Mm. That's the kind of student we want, and that's where your financial aid and through the Stanford Fund, that's something that it supports. Last year, 75% of the gifts given to Stanford were $100,000 or less. So the power of this collective giving is important and strong, and why we need gifts of all sizes. Expendable gifts allow us to support current increasing needs and try new things, where endowment allows us to support those ideas that are most successful and allows us to stay at the forefront of innovation and excellence. And we are certainly grateful to all of those who can make gifts directed to endowment and larger gifts, the needs that arise. But we're also grateful for the annual gifts that help financial aid and help programs that are within the undergraduate experience. So for example, I mentioned a few days ago that there was support for social dance that is one of the most popular courses among students, and support from the Stanford Fund has allowed more students to dance. So as well as we've seen support for the DGen office and for programs such as Stanford in New York. These gifts collectively make it possible to address where the world is going and to have the kind of impact that we were just talking about in a variety of disciplines, from medicine to social sciences to technology.
Well, and I think in summary, just a slight correction, 75% of the gifts given were of $1,000 or less.
What did I say?
You said $100,000. So
I'm so sorry.
No. That's nice.
That's important to say.
But to underscore the dance, I think that volunteers in university do together. We've often heard many of our leaders talk about the secret sauce of Stanford is its volunteers and the commitment that volunteers make and continue to work side by side with the university. And for me, I'm most proud of being able to play that role and to serve alongside of all of you as a staff member here at Stanford. So on behalf of my fellow reunion committee members, I thank you for all the work that you do to make this place purposeful and have a huge impact and looking towards the future. And I think on behalf of all of our colleagues as volunteers, we're happy to help support that mission and see it to a wonderful conclusion. So thank you so much. And thank you to Erin for putting all of this together, and onward and upward to a wonderful, wonderful reunion year.
Yes. Thank you all. And just to wrap up the call, we did record this, so it will be sent out to everybody that was on the committee today. We're so grateful to having all of you guys again, just to reiterate what Donna said, serve in this way throughout the rest of the year. And there's certainly exciting things ahead. All of these big, incredible ideas that were shared today, we are going to be working toward into the future. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks.